So today we are celebrating Easter, of course. This is the day that Jesus rose from the grave after his crucifixion on the cross. So this is the day in history that we remember all that Jesus did for us, and that we recognize that our hope that we can spend eternity with God has actually been realized. In Jesus' resurrection, what it also means beyond the fact that Jesus, of course, rose from the dead, it also means that all of the things that he said were actually true. Because, of course, no normal person can just rise from the dead. So this is something that Jesus predicted. He prophesied that he would rise from the dead, and that is what he did exactly. So because of that, we can trust what he said as actually being true. And that his death on our behalf means that we are, as long as we are followers of him, our sins have been forgiven. Now, when people talk about the resurrection of Jesus, when people give evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, there are all sorts of reasons or proofs that people will go through and say, oh, well, this is why we should trust that the resurrection actually happened, why it's an undeniable fact. And one of those evidences that people will give, that they will talk about, is eyewitness accounts. That basically so many people saw Jesus return from the grave, resurrected, that it must be true. This must be an undeniable fact because of all these eyewitnesses that saw him. And it is true that this is evidence for the resurrection. But we have to recognize that there are eyewitnesses to all sorts of things. Bigfoot, aliens, people seen Elvis alive still, It would be foolish for us to just believe that every sincere witness, whoever is out there, is accurately conveying to us truth. Which is why I think that many people can be rather dismissive of the biblical accounts and the biblical eyewitnesses, the miraculous nature of the resurrection. Because if they can't trust these other eyewitnesses for these other things, these other supernatural events, then why trust the biblical ones? What makes the story of Jesus and his resurrection any different from somebody who claims, for example, that they're the reincarnation of Joan of Arc? I mean, what makes it different? What makes it stand out? I mean, more than one founder of a new religion or self-proclaimed prophet has claimed to have been visited by a god or an angel of some sort. More than one person has claimed to be divine, or that an encounter that they had with God in some way opened their minds to something new and amazing that overrules and overwrites all previous revelation that humankind has ever received. But not all of these truths can actually be true. They can't all be correct. Now, perhaps some of these eyewitnesses who talk about all these different things, maybe some of them are outright lying, and that's just what's going on. That probably is true. But I think it is most common that what's going on with these eyewitnesses is extreme self-deception. Extreme self-deception. In the early 90s and in the late 90s and the early 2000s, there was a show that many of you are probably familiar with that was called The X-Files. Many of you have probably seen that, maybe enjoyed that. And the premise of the show is that there were these two FBI agents that were tasked with solving unusual and previously unsolved crimes known as the X-Files. And typically these cases involve something paranormal or aliens or something like that. And one of the two agents, whose name was Dana Scully, she was a skeptic. That was kind of her role. She generally believed that there was a rational or a naturalistic or a scientific explanation for everything. While the other agent, Fox Mulder, who was a true believer in the paranormal and in aliens and things like that, his inclination was that those things were true, and he kind of wanted to prove that stuff to the whole world. And there was a poster that hung in Mulder's office that kind of summed up his character. And the poster was of a flying saucer, and underneath it was written, "I want to believe." So that was his bent. That was his sort of inclination. He wanted to believe. So where Scully would look at the data, whatever the information was, and assume a naturalistic answer, Mulder would look at the same data and assume a supernatural answer. And the reason I'm bringing this up is not because I'm trying to pit a skeptic against a believer, but to point out that when it comes to processing information, as humans, when we process information, people tend to believe what they want to believe. People tend to believe what they already believe is true. And even if the data on hand is very much against or different from what their normal worldview or their normal perception is, they're going to have a tendency to kind of bend that data, to twist it, to fit with the ideas that they already agree with. That's just sort of the human tendency. And this becomes a real problem when it comes to trusting eyewitnesses. Because if an eyewitness to something, whatever it is, has a leaning towards believing something already, then whatever they see, they're generally going to interpret that to fit into what they already believe. That's going to just be their natural bent. So even though the accounts of Jesus, his resurrection, these eyewitness accounts, are professing its truth, because that's what they are evidence for the resurrection, it's important that we are more discerning than just that. Because again, why should we believe the eyewitnesses of the Bible rather than the eyewitnesses of any other religion, for that matter? Or even our coworker who really, really saw Elvis the other day. I mean, why believe one versus the other? But it's my belief that the eyewitnesses of Christianity stand out as being unique. They're unique in their trustworthiness compared to the eyewitnesses of the same sort, whether it's of other religions or other things that are beyond what we would normally see. And because of this, we have very good reason to trust what they have to say. That we can trust what these eyewitnesses saw and their ability to accurately tell us what they saw when it comes to the actual resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the first truth that we can trust in when it comes to trusting these eyewitness accounts, the first truth is that Jesus actually died. That Jesus actually died. He didn't kind of die, or had the sort of death where maybe somebody made a mistake and they thought he died, but he didn't really die. Actually called him dead when he wasn't. I mean, you hear of those horror stories, of course, where, a doctor misdiagnoses a death and somebody, wakes up in the morgue, or even worse, you hear about the horror stories of them waking up in a coffin or something. I mean, this is not the kind of death that Jesus died, where that kind of mistake could really be made. I mean, Jesus was beaten, he was tortured, he was crucified, and in the end, we read this from John 19:31. It says, "It was the day of preparation, and the Jewish leaders didn't want bodies hanging there the next day." This was on the cross, which was the Sabbath, a very special Sabbath because it was Passover week. So they asked Pilate to hasten their deaths by ordering that their legs be broken and that their bodies could be taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the two men crucified with Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. Now, there have been many medical analyses done of this sort of event, this sort of flowing of blood and water, and trying to understand sort of the significance of what that meant in verse 34. And there may be a theological significance to that as well, but physiologically, the general medical conclusion has been that this separation of fluids, of blood and water, separate like this, flowing out of a human body, is not going to happen in a living person. It's not going to happen in a living person. So this is evidence that death has already occurred. And if you take into account that the Romans were professional executioners, I mean, that's really what they were, who would have faced the severest of penalties if they had somehow said, well, this person that we were supposed to kill wasn't actually dead when they said he was dead. They would have probably faced punishment for that. We should take their conclusion, the Romans' conclusion that Jesus was dead, seriously. Especially considering that unlike doctors, a doctor can make a mistake and make a misdiagnosis. Anybody could do that. But doctors don't have the ability nor the desire to make sure somebody they said is dead is actually dead by inflicting further, pain on them or something, right? But the Romans didn't care. They were going to do this. They clearly stabbed people to make sure they were actually dead. So this is evidence that death did indeed occur. Also, Jesus couldn't have faked his death in this way. He couldn't have pulled off sort of a massive deception about his death, like some sort of illusionists or magician's act. When a magician does something that's death-defying in some way, if a magician wanted to perform this sort of a trick, if you will, to make it look like he had died when he hadn't actually died, he would have to control all the variables of the situation, and including the perception of anybody who was actually watching his supposed death. So, for example, if Jesus was trying to do that from the cross, for starters, he would have had to somehow be in league with and pay off those guys who came along who were trying to hasten his death, or who were, especially if they were the guys who were going to be, doing something to him, stabbing him, or just calling him dead in the end. He would have had to sort of be in league with them some way, paying them off. Probably had to get one of those fake spears that the thing goes in when you fake blood. Whatever. He would have had to have orchestrated all of that stuff for this to actually happen. But how could Jesus possibly know that the right guards were going to be there at the right time? How could he know that? What about those who nailed him to the cross? Were those fake nails? What was going on in that situation? How was a Jew like Jesus going to convince the Romans to have him fake crucified? It just doesn't make sense. How could anybody control all of those variables when so many people legitimately wanted to see Jesus dead? How could he possibly control all that stuff? Does anybody really think that pulling something like that off is really even remotely plausible in this sort of situation? Jesus just simply could not have pulled off a deception like this. It just would not have been possible. Once things were in Romans' hands, the last thing that Jesus and his disciples would have had was control over the situation. The religious leaders, they wanted Jesus dead. And the Romans knew how to execute people and ensure they were actually dead. And dead is what Jesus definitely was by the time they took him off the cross. Now, if Jesus' death had been something maybe more like, he fell into a coma, maybe somebody could conclude that, he hadn't actually died. You could see somebody coming back from something like that. It seemed like it was death, but it wasn't really. But Jesus was really, really dead. He's really dead. Professionally executed, stabbed in the side, kind of dead. And we can trust that the religious leaders and the Romans would have ensured that he was really dead, because this was in their best interest. There was no coming back from this type of death, at least not for the normal human. So the first important fact about the resurrection, and really the first important thing that we can trust that the eyewitnesses are accurately telling us is that Jesus actually died. Pretty simple at this point. But the second important fact takes a little bit more explanation. Because when we think about the resurrection, really the second important fact is after the resurrection, Jesus lived again. And again, this is what the eyewitnesses are telling us this. And we can trust this to be an accurate account from them as well. And I just want to explain why. So first of all, this wasn't Jesus' body just sort of disappeared, so he must have resurrected. He must have been raised from the dead. That wasn't the type of resurrection that this was, of the body just vanishing. Honestly, that would have been pretty easy to fake. You just get rid of the body. He raised from the dead. And the religious leaders, of course, wanted to prevent that type of a ruse. So they posted guards at the tomb to make sure that the disciples weren't going to come in and steal the body and then make this type of claim about the resurrection. But a disappearing body was not the type of resurrection that Jesus had in mind. Tell me, how do you fake a resurrected Jesus walking around and talking to the disciples for as long as he did? It's not like the accounts that we have are, Jesus, waving at the disciples from a faraway distance on a foggy day, and they can just kind of see him. It's not like, the accounts are just, Jesus in a darkened room one night and they kind of see him there. I mean, those are not the types of biblical accounts that we have of Jesus after the resurrection. He spent 40 days, like I already said, 40 days with the disciples, walking and talking with them. And this man that the disciples had spent so much time with, I mean, they knew Jesus before, of course, and they would have known if this wasn't actually Jesus. I mean, if this was, somebody else who maybe looked kind of like Jesus, the disciples would have known, given how much time they actually spent with him after the resurrection. Now, because of this, some people have suggested, maybe the disciples were all in on this whole thing. That, they knew that, sure, Jesus died, and they got a double to come in who kind of looked like Jesus, and they were in on this whole thing so that they could convince everybody that Jesus had actually raised from the dead. But remember that almost all of the disciples were ultimately killed for this belief. They were ultimately killed for being Christians, for being followers of Jesus. And it's unlikely that most of them, if not all of them, would have been willing to die for something that they knew was really just a lie and a deception. There would have been no benefit to them to doing that, of course. What was for them to gain from dying for a lie? Now, if they really believe that Jesus was raised from the dead, it makes sense. Okay, they're dying for what they believe. That makes sense. But if they knew that Jesus never was raised from the dead, why would they die for that? So this explanation doesn't really make sense, that the disciples were somehow in on this ruse to convince everybody that the guy that they, was a sort of a double or something was sort of standing in for Jesus. That explanation just doesn't really make sense. Others have suggested that, maybe this whole story was just made up well after the fact. All the disciples were dead at this point, and at that point, it's easy to make up a myth about somebody because nobody's around still who can say, that thing didn't really happen. So others will say that this was just a myth that was made up, years later down the road. And that might be a reasonable explanation if we didn't know how soon after Jesus' life the Gospels and the letters were actually written. But these things were written by Jesus' contemporaries. They were written within their lifetimes. And they would have known if these letters, if the Gospels themselves were fabricated in some way, if they weren't explaining what actually had occurred. And we have to remember, of course, that when the Gospels talk about the resurrection of Jesus, this wasn't just one of many miracles. That maybe some of you are like, that's fine if that one wasn't true, whatever, it just was one of many miracles. The resurrection itself is just not one of many miracles. Really, the resurrection is the hinge point of Christianity. It says this in 1 Corinthians 15:14. If Christ has not been raised, then all of our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. So really, all of Christianity hinges on this miracle more than anything else, that the resurrection itself is a true event that actually happened. Now, if Jesus' disciples knew that the resurrection didn't actually happen, that the stories were a lie, they would have known the whole thing was a lie. The whole faith itself was a lie. But there's no evidence that we have of any of these guys denouncing the Gospels, denouncing any of the letters. In fact, we have evidence of them embracing these things. And again, if they knew that the resurrection was sort of the hinge point of all of Christianity, they would have known that if it didn't happen, that would mean everything was a lie. So why would they go to their deaths, again, for a lie? It just doesn't make any sense that they would have offered their lives up for something that they knew was a lie. So it doesn't make sense as a possible explanation that these stories about the resurrection of Jesus were somehow myths made up well after the fact. Because again, we have this evidence that these letters, the Gospels themselves, were written within the lifetime of Jesus' contemporaries. And they would not have died for a lie. And they would not have embraced these things if they weren't indeed true. So this explanation doesn't make sense. Other people have suggested that when people claimed that they saw Jesus resurrected, that this was just somehow, just a widespread deception, a widespread self-deception even, brainwashing, hypnosis, that even the disciples themselves, they truly believed that they saw Jesus because they had deceived themselves into thinking that they were seeing Jesus. And that therefore all the people around them as well were being influenced to believe they had seen Jesus, even if they hadn't really. And I would say, at least in my opinion, I guess, of all the objections to a true resurrection actually happening, this is probably the most plausible objection. Not that I'm saying it is plausible. But the reason I say it's probably the most plausible is because these types of things do actually happen in our modern day. We see this type of stuff happen in cults and in so-called churches, where people start to think that they see things that aren't there because of a very heavy influence and sort of a self-deception that exists in those places. But even so, even in those environments, it takes a lot of prepping, it takes a lot of grooming. It really takes a lot to get people to be manipulated to the point where they're going to be ready to believe something kind of crazy, something out there that doesn't normally happen. And those people have to be basically at a point where they're ready and they're open for suggestion. For example, if a church or some sort of a group, so-called church, I will say, was meeting for a couple of hours, and they were meeting in a darkened sanctuary, and there was a lot of emotional music playing, there was singing going on, and the speaker there kept telling people that at some point that evening, God was going to show up as like a mystical cloud on the ceiling, right? That was what he was saying. Unfortunately, what would probably happen is some of the people in the congregation would start to believe and expect that that is actually what was going to happen. And after the event was over, some of those people would believe it actually did happen, that they saw God show up as this mystical cloud on the ceiling of the building. They would basically convince themselves that they had seen something that had not actually happened. This is the power of suggestion that, like it or not, humans are very prone to be manipulated by. We just are. And maybe you think that sounds ridiculous. Maybe you're like, I don't see that ever happening to me or anybody I ever know. But let me ask you, how have you behaved when you've been alone, in a dark house, dark room, right after you've watched a scary movie? Did you behave differently right after that than maybe you would normally if you were alone in a dark house by yourself in a dark room? I mean, you probably did, because basically you've been prepped for an hour and a half to think that every sound, every light is something trying to kill you. So you act differently. So we're all prone to this kind of manipulation and grooming. When I was a kid, I was sort of fascinated by the idea of ghosts. And so some of my friends, I was in 6th grade, we were convinced that our school was haunted. So we would go into the boys' bathroom and turn out the lights and wait for ghosts to appear in the bathroom. And inevitably, we would see things, But, of course, we were looking for that stuff. And your brain and your eyes do weird things when you're looking in a dark room and looking for things to appear that probably are not there. And I'll tell you that I would not trust at all my own eyewitness testimony as a 6th grader from looking in a dark bathroom in school, right? Because odds are that a person who casually walked into that darkened boys' bathroom, casually walked into the room where you're by yourself at home in the dark after you watched a scary movie, casually walked into that darkened sanctuary that I mentioned earlier, that person would probably walk in and see nothing abnormal at all. They just wouldn't see anything, because they hadn't been prepped or groomed to be looking for something that wasn't actually there. They're not going to fall for this sort of self-deception that everybody else has sort of gotten sucked into. But these types of highly emotional or scary or dimly illuminated types of deceptive experiences really are nothing like the encounters that we read about in Scripture with Jesus after his resurrection. Now, I think we can all imagine that somebody might be deceived into thinking, hey, they saw Jesus kind of like slip around a corner. Oh, yeah, they might think that they saw Jesus in that situation. But it's really going to be very difficult, and I have an extremely hard time believing that this is even possible, for a whole group of people to deceive themselves into thinking that they sat down, had this long face-to-face conversation and a meal with Jesus and all these other people around them, and everybody is telling the same story of the same experience. I have a very hard time believing that that type of mass deception is even possible. But these are the types of situations that we read about in Scripture. So this is totally different from the type of deception, self-deception, that often happens that I was mentioning earlier. In the Gospels, we have 40 days worth of stories of post-resurrection experiences, multi-hour conversations with Jesus, inside events, outside events, morning and evening occurrences, several stories of meals with Jesus, several stories of people touching Jesus physically. So, they were very close to him, miracles performed by Jesus, and then finally Jesus' ascension into heaven. And again, I find it very hard to believe that such a widespread deception could be maintained by so many people with so many close encounters for such a wide variety of environments for such a lengthy period of time, even amongst people who really, 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 really wanted to believe that they saw Jesus. I still find it implausible. But on top of this, there's good reason to believe that the disciples weren't actually prepped this way at all. They weren't really in a position where they were predisposed to the idea that Jesus was going to actually physically return from the dead. Now, Jesus said he was going to do that. He said he was going to return from the dead. But the disciples didn't seem to understand that until after it had actually happened. So, for example, Mary Magdalene, she found the empty tomb. And her first reaction to that wasn't, oh, yeah, Jesus has been resurrected from the dead. Her first reaction was, somebody stole his body, right? We'd probably react much the same way. Later, when the apostles were first told by the women that Jesus had been raised from the dead, we read this in Luke 24:11. It says, "But the story sounded like nonsense to the men, so they didn't believe it." Who would? I mean, you wouldn't. I probably wouldn't believe that story. When Thomas was told by the rest of the disciples, these are men that he trusted, he had lived his life with for several years. He was told by them that Jesus was raised from the dead. His response in the Gospel of John was, "I won't believe it unless I see the nail wounds of his hands, put my fingers into them, and place my hand into the wound at his side." Why should he believe such a crazy story? Still later, after all the disciples had even seen Jesus, they came into his presence again, and we read about it in Matthew 28. But some of them still doubted that they were physically seeing Jesus in front of them. It says this in Matthew 28:18. Matthew 28, 16 through 17. When the 11 disciples left for Galilee, going to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go, when they saw him, they worshiped him, but some of them doubted. So the main followers of Jesus, the disciples and those that were kind of in that immediate circle of Jesus, all of these people didn't seem to be too inclined to believe that Jesus had actually been raised from the dead. They were reluctant to trust the words of people that they knew really well, and they were even reluctant to trust their own eyes at times, because these things just didn't fit what they expected to happen. Yet eventually, of course, they all came to believe and shared their eyewitness accounts that Jesus was definitely alive. And the point being of all this is that the eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection weren't basing their belief that Jesus was alive on very brief and very controlled encounters with Jesus. They weren't basing it on that type of thing. They weren't basing it on the types of encounters where it's easy to convince yourself that you saw something that you really didn't, because those weren't the types of encounters that they had. These were long, drawn-out encounters in a wide variety of environments with a wide variety of people. But also, these disciples had not been groomed or manipulated such that they were ready to believe something crazy about Jesus, like him returning from the grave. Rather, they were more inclined to believe that people who said that happened, that they were either lying or they themselves were confused. And what this means is that we have credible eyewitnesses telling us that Jesus lived again. The kind of eyewitnesses who were skeptical that that actually was true until they were presented with undeniable truth of that fact. But there's another eyewitness whose account we should consider as well. A man who was an even bigger skeptic than all the disciples. And I've heard it said that this skeptic turned believer is perhaps one of the largest evidences that we have of Jesus' resurrection. And this skeptic is, of course, the Apostle Paul. Paul was not only skeptical of Christianity, but he was dead set against Christianity. He went around persecuting Christians. And very rarely does that type of person do a 180 and become what they were previously against. Now, that does happen sometimes, but it never happens in just a few days. It might take years for that kind of transition to happen in thought. Unless, of course, a person is suddenly confronted with completely convincing, undeniable truth that what they believed before was totally wrong, which is, of course, what we see with Paul. In Acts 9, we read that Paul was breaking out murderous threats against the Christians. He asked for a letter from the high priest to grant him authority to take prisoner anybody who claimed to be a Christian in the nearby city of Damascus. Yet as he traveled from Jerusalem to Damascus, we read of this encounter. It starts in verse 3, Acts 9, verse 3. As Saul was approaching Damascus on his mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice saying, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. And the voice replied, I am Jesus, the one you are persecuting. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. The men with Saul stood speechless, for they heard the sound of someone's voice but saw no one. Saul picked himself up off the ground, and when he opened his eyes, he was blind. So his companions led him by the hand to Damascus. He remained there blind for 3 days and did not eat or drink. So Paul, who at this point was known as Saul, encountered Jesus in an extremely powerful way. He literally heard Jesus, and he saw this blinding light that did physically blind him for a time until he was healed miraculously later on. But this event changed him from being a skeptic, dead set against Christianity, to being a fully invested believer. And he remained fully invested for the rest of his life. This would be kind of like, if you can imagine this happening, Andrew Cuomo or Joe Biden suddenly telling everybody that they should vote for Donald Trump in 2024, right? I mean, that'd be crazy. Nobody would expect that to ever happen. But if they did say that, and they were sincere in their minds, and they were not going crazy or something, they were clearly thinking right, you can bet that people would listen to that. And they would, especially people who were former skeptics of Donald Trump, might now think twice. Because it is not at all normal for somebody who is a complete skeptic, a total opponent, dead set against something, to make this rapid shift to suddenly believing and professing and following something that they were totally against before. Unless, of course, again, they are confronted with the undeniable truth of this different thing and how what they believed before was totally wrong. And Paul's shift in thinking is just as dramatic as this. And we should take serious note of that. Paul had nothing to gain. He had everything to lose by doing this. And with nothing to gain, we should trust that his account is actually true. Why else would he put everything on the line? Why would he do that? As such, Paul's conversion is one of the strongest eyewitness evidences of the truth of Jesus' resurrection. That Jesus did indeed live again. So for all of these reasons, we should take the accuracy and the trustworthiness of the biblical eyewitnesses of Jesus' death and his resurrection very seriously. Way more than we might take eyewitnesses of other so-called religions or so-called supernatural events. Because invariably in those cases, the eyewitnesses do not have the type of credibility that we see with the biblical eyewitnesses. So what does this mean for you and me? What it means is that, first off, we should have confidence that Jesus actually died and that Jesus actually lived again. He said that this was going to happen. This is what Jesus spoke about to his disciples, that this was going to happen to him. And since it did happen, as he said it would, we should believe the other things that Jesus said as well. We should believe what he said, that which is written on the front of our building, that Jesus said he was the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one comes to the Father except through him. There's only one way, only one truth, only one way to eternal life, and that is through Jesus Christ alone. Jesus who died for you, Jesus who died for me. If you're not a follower of Jesus Christ today, I would encourage you, after service, come talk to me, talk to somebody else at this church about that. Jesus is inviting you to follow him today. Let's pray.